I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Really excited with this message. There we go. Now I can talk a little bit quieter, save my voice. Really excited to bring this message to you guys tonight because it's really touched my heart this week and really been working on me more than most sermons do. I mean, I always get something out of them, but this one has really kind of been gnawing at me and been working on my life as well as yours. So hopefully you will get something out of it like I got something out of it. But tonight we are going to be looking at a message entitled The Handwriting on the Wall out of Daniel 5. We're actually going to be looking at Daniel 4 and 5 and looking at these stories of the handwriting on the wall. Now, to get started with this, I want to ask a participation question, all right? How many of us have made the same mistake at least twice? All right? Put your hands up, right? Yeah. Whether it's on like a test at school, or if you're like me or Corey, you're playing a video game and you're trying to get past this level over and over and over again, and you keep making the same mistake, right? Like I remember I was playing Halo, and there's this one corner you come to, and there's 3 snipers up top, all right? And every time I kept peeking my head around, bam, and I'm just dead. I'm like, what the heck? Probably 20 times I tried to sneak past them, and every time I got killed. And I kept making that same mistake over and over and over again, right? I don't remember how I got past it. It was a long time ago. But here's the point. Here's the point. The point is this. We make the same mistakes all the time. Even as Christians, we make the same mistakes over and over again. And so the question that I want us to focus on tonight is, how do we respond to our sin? How do you respond to your sin? Do you dive deeper into more sin because you think, well, I'm already in it this deep, why not keep going? Or do you change your path and seek the face of God and humbly come before Him to ask His forgiveness and for His help? How do you respond to your sin? So, let's start with our story. And like I said, we're mainly going to be focusing on chapter 5, but it's important for you to know what happened in chapter 4 as it's referenced to in chapter 5. Okay? And that is this. Dane, please stop, man. Appreciate it if you would, please. All right? It's just been nonstop since I started. Normally I don't like to do this, but you guys gotta be respectful sometimes. All right? So, we need to back up and we need to look at chapter 4. Last week we were in chapter 3 and we were looking at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And after that, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 was looking over his kingdom. And he began to become very proud of his kingdom and all that he thought he had accomplished and all that he thought he had done. And one night, after feeling so prideful about all the things he had done, he had this dream about this massive tree that covered a large portion of the earth. And it had plenty of room and shelter and shade, and all of the animals came and they ate the food and they felt full. And they stayed there and they felt had shelter and they felt safe. But then Nebuchadnezzar said that out of the heavens came one that looked like the Holy One. And he came and he chopped down the tree. And all of the animals scattered and were left, and there was no more food, no more shelter, and no more safe haven for those animals to come. And so he wakes up the next morning and he's perplexed, and he brings all of his wise men to him. And he says, what does this, he didn't bring all of his wise men. He's already learned that. He learned that several chapters ago. He calls to his best wise men, Daniel. And he goes, Daniel, what does this dream mean? And Daniel kind of hesitates. And he goes, look, you've been right most of the time, Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel. So don't worry about whether it's good or bad. Just tell me what it means so I know. And so Daniel goes, well, what it means is the tree represents your kingdom. And it represents the fact that you have created this great kingdom that is plentiful. It is grown big and strong. It protects and it takes care of everyone. But because of your pride, because of the fact that you think you're the one who did this all, the Holy One, God, is going to come down and He's going to humble you. He's going to remove you from your kingdom. He's going to make you go crazy, all right? He's going to send you out, and you are going to be sent out with the wild animals, and you're going to think you're a wild animal. Your hair is going to grow long and shaggy. Your nails are going to grow sharp like claws, and you will be sent out among the animals until you realize that it is God who is the great king and ruler of this world. And so Nebuchadnezzar goes, okay, and that doesn't sound too great, but all right, I know you, you're not messing around. Well, about 12 months later, about a year later, he's walking on his palace. He's sitting there and he's talking, and he's like, look at my great kingdom. It's so awesome. It's so amazing. I love this kingdom. Look at all that I have done, all the wealth I have attributed. And all of a sudden, he started slurring his words. And he started acting weird. And as he's talking to his advisors, he goes absolutely nuts. And he runs out of the palace. He tears his clothes off, and he runs out, and he becomes almost like a wild animal. And he lives among the animals for quite a while. Until one day, he looks up to heaven. And as he looks up, his sanity begins to return. And he calls out to God, and he says, God, you are the one who can humble the prideful. You are the one who allowed me to build this kingdom up. And he began to worship God as the true king of heaven. Well, his sanity was returned. He came back and reassumed his throne, but shortly thereafter he passed away. And 20 years later, after this incident, we pick up with the kingdom of Babylon. And now a young king by the name of Belshazzar is ruling the kingdom. He is actually Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and his father is the king over all of the Babylonian empire, but he has been given the throne as second in command, and his area is to rule over all of Babylon. And so he's there ruling. But there's a problem. You see, there's an enemy that's lurking, and the Persian and Mede army have come together, and they are on the outside of the walls of Babylon, preparing to invade and have them in a siege. But Belshazzar is so prideful in what Babylon is and how much food and resources they have, he pays no attention to it. In fact, instead of strategizing and planning and figuring out a way to defeat this great army of the Persian Empire, he decides, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw a party. And he throws a party. And he brings 1,000 of his greatest nobles in. He brings in his wives, his concubines, everybody that's in the palace that is under his authority comes to this party, and they are having a great time. They are drinking wine. No one can see straight. They're dancing. They're having a good time. And finally, it gets to a point where they're so far gone, he goes, hey, I got an idea. You remember all those temple relics and vessels and utensils that my grandfather Nebuchadnezzar pulled out of the temple in Egypt? Let's bring those out and let's drink wine out of those. And let's use those to worship our gods. And so he goes and he gets these temple elements and he brings them out, and they begin drinking wine out of them, using them for worship, and just desecrating these vessels that were meant to worship the one true God. Well, as they're doing this, all of a sudden the party comes to an abrupt stop. And Belshazzar is looking around trying to figure out, and then over on the wall, he sees a floating hand. Just a hand floating there. And the hand is carving a message into the plaster on the wall. And it carves 4 words. And he looks at these 4 words and he goes, what is going on? And he becomes pale white, it says. His knees begin to knock. He's so afraid. He calls all of his wise men to him and he goes, you guys need to interpret this. What do these words say and what do they mean? What is going on here? This is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And they're looking at this picture on the wall and they're going, no clue. We don't know what's going on. And he becomes even more petrified and more scared. And he doesn't know what's going on or what's happening. Well, his mother, the queen, hears about this. And she comes rushing over from wherever she was at. And she comes in and she goes, "Hey, Belshazzar, the king, there is one who served your predecessor. His name is Daniel. He was the best of the best. He was appointed to be the top wise man, the head of the mediums, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. He has the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Call him and he can interpret this message for you." And so he's like, "Okay, can't hurt." And Daniel comes. They beckon Daniel. Now Daniel's probably about 80. He's probably like retired, kicking it at home, or maybe he's still serving his father, the king, over all of Babylon. But he brings him over, and he comes to him and he goes, "Look, my mom said some pretty cool stuff about you, and I don't know if it's true." Kind of skeptical. "But if you can interpret that, I'll give you a purple robe, a gold chain, and I will make you third in command. It'll be my father, me, and then you over all of Babylon." And he goes, "Can you interpret this for me?" And Daniel looks at him and he goes, "You can keep your gifts, but I will interpret the dream for you." But before I do you remember what happened to your grandfather? Do you remember how he was so prideful and boastful? What happened to him? He turned into a wild animal. God humbled him and he sent him out, and then he came back. All right? He came back and he was praising the God, my God. He said, "You should have remembered that. Because now you have become prideful, you have become boastful, and you have desecrated his articles, and you have blasphemed against my God. Here is what your message means." The 4 words were meaning, tekel, and parshin. And Daniel's interpretation is this: meaning means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom, and he's brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed and in the balance, and you have been found deficient or unworthy. And Perez, he has divided and has decided to give your kingdom to the Medes and the Persians. And Belshazzar is shocked. He goes ahead and he awards everything that he promised to Daniel, even though Daniel didn't want it. And he goes and he sits down and he begins to contemplate what's happening. And then the text says something very interesting. It says, that very night, the Persians invaded. And Belshazzar was killed, and the Babylonian kingdom was turned over to Darius and Medes. And so we have this story of Belshazzar, who repeated the same mistake that his grandfather repeated. And it cost him the kingdom. And so our first faith lesson for tonight is this: God responds to sin. God responds to sin. No matter what it looks like, God is in control. All right? I want you guys to understand that. No matter what it looks like, no matter how crazy your life is, no matter how much of a tailspin it's in, God is in control of everything that goes on. He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to defeat and exile Israel. When they got out of hand, he stepped in and said, "Look, I've got to punish you guys. You're not listening. You're not following what I have put in place for you. And so I'm going to discipline you. You're going to face the consequences." And he exiled them. But then what happened when Nebuchadnezzar became too proud? God humbled him. And Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. Then his grandson comes along, and what happened to him? He got too proud. He decided to desecrate the temple vessels. And what happened? God removed him from his role and from his purpose. You see, God will respond to sin. And here's what we have to remember. These were two of the most powerful men on the earth. And that may be hard for us to understand. So I'm going to put it into context for you. Like most people will be like, well, they were like the President of the United States. Okay, that's a start. But that's not even close to who these guys were. All right? Yeah, the President of the United States is considered one of the most powerful men in the world, but he's far from being the most powerful. These guys had conquered most of the known world at that time. They had encompassed most of the known world at that time. They were literally the most powerful men on the planet. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar even referred to himself as a god. And yet God still humbled them. God still responded to their sins. So if God's going to respond to their sins, how can we think that he won't respond to ours? Because he responded to theirs. And he will respond to ours. Whether we want it to or not. God will respond to our sin. So here's the second faith lesson. We must learn from those mistakes that we've made before. And we also must learn from those who came before us. All right? When Daniel confronted I forgot his name. I can't believe I forgot his name. Belshazzar. There we go. Whew. How can you forget that name? That's a mouthful. When Daniel confronted Belshazzar, he referred to Nebuchadnezzar. And he told him, he said, hey, you remember your grandfather, what happened to him? How God humbled him? Well, you're making the same mistake. Now, Belshazzar, he was educated. He was taught. He had the knowledge. He knew everything about the previous kings. And obviously, when the most powerful king in the world goes crazy and turns into a wild animal, not literally, but in actions, that's going to be something that's written down in the history books. All right? People aren't going to miss that. All of a sudden, the king goes missing. People are going to notice that the king's gone. So he should have known and should have learned what his grandfather had to learn. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar said, never desecrate anything of the God of Israel. And then at the end, when Nebuchadnezzar finally came back, he said in verse 36 of chapter 4, at that time my sanity returned to me, and my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and my nobles sought me out. I was reestablished over my kingdom, and even more greatness came to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven, because all his works are true and his ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride. This would have been something that was taught to Belshazzar. But yet, he did not learn from those mistakes. We should do the same. We should learn from the mistakes of those who came before us. We should not repeat the mistakes that we have seen. Why should we repeat? Most of the time everybody picks on you guys, right? So I'm going to reverse the roles tonight. Let's pick on our parents. All right? Right? Let's pick on the parents. Adults, trust me, this will work out, I promise, all right? So I see some of these dads back here like, wait a minute, all right? Let's talk about our parents for a second. Why should we repeat the same mistakes that our parents make? Right? Learning from our parents is just not about what we should do. It's also about what we shouldn't do. All right? If your dad or mom treats you in a negative way that you don't like, you should remember that and not treat your brother, your sister, your mom, or your friend like they treated you. Their bad example is not an excuse for you or freedom for you to go, hey, it's okay for me to act dirty and nasty to somebody else because my parents acted dirty and nasty to me. Your parents get a divorce and one of your parents treats the other like dirt. Learn from that. Don't make that mistake. Be a better spouse. Be a better friend. Don't make those same mistakes. Let me give you an example. All right? This is a personal example. But my son and I are exactly alike. If you don't know this, we are almost identical. We are almost identical. All right? And because of that, we clash heads a lot. All right? And he thinks he can take me. All right? Keyword thinks. All right? But I remember, I don't know, it was 6 months, a year, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, sometime in the last few years, we got into an argument. I don't even remember what it was over. I bet it was because he back-talked his mom, or he wouldn't get off the Xbox. One of the two. Those are the most common. Right. Okay, hold on. I can't do that. We're supposed to be picking on the parents, not on the kids. I'm sorry, Ty. That's not what I meant. All right, we're supposed to be picking on the parents. I apologize. All right? So we had gotten into an argument, and it was probably the worst we had had that day. It was a knockout, drag-out fight. Things were thrown, walls were punched, holes were made. It was not pretty, all right? He was trying to stand up to me, and I was going, I'm your father, I will own you. It was not a very happy time, all right? Listen up, guys. All right? So, we went at it, and we were yelling, and we were throwing, and we were both guilty of a lot of things. But here's the point. I screwed up, Roy. All right? I should not have reacted that way. And so, afterwards, I sent him to his room. I went to my room. My wife sent me to my room, I should say. I got in trouble, all right? But I went to my room, and I thought about what I said and what I had done and how I had reacted. And I realized that I had screwed up royally. And so I went into his room. Before I entered, I said, hey, are you ready to talk? And he goes, yeah. I said, all right. And so we sat down, and we began talking about what I had done wrong. And I apologized, and I said there's no excuse for it, and I shouldn't treat you like that. I shouldn't do those things to you. And we began working through it. But then I turned to him, and I said, Ty, I want you to remember how you feel right now, or how you felt in that moment. I want you to remember what this feels like, and how hurt, how frustrated, how broken you feel. And the reason I want you to remember that is because I want you to think about that the next time you start to treat somebody like I treated you. Because the truth is, we're exactly alike. And at some point, rather recently, he treats his sister, his mom, his brother, his friends like that. And if we don't learn to work together, and to teach him to not do those things, eventually he's going to do it to his kids. And so the point is this. When your parents do something, guys, when your parents do something that upsets you, that doesn't seem fair, that doesn't seem right, remember that. Learn from it. Become better than they are. Because we all have choices in here. We all have choices. We can choose to make the same mistakes and go down the same path and leave people miserable just like we're miserable. Or we can choose to be different. We can choose to make correct decisions. We can choose to learn from their mistakes and be better human beings. Look at the misery and the failures that their mistakes have caused to others and to you, and learn from it and be better than they are. Because here's the deal, guys. Judgment is coming. Whether we want it to or not, judgment is coming. For Nebuchadnezzar, it took 12 months. For Belshazzar, it took just a few hours. But judgment came nonetheless. And regardless of the time, judgment will come. And we have to be ready for it. And what I find interesting, and I don't know if this is the case or if it's because Belshazzar went a step further, but what I find interesting is Nebuchadnezzar, who was the first time around, his punishment or judgment came, he had a little bit of grace. It took a while to get there. But Belshazzar, when he should have known better, when he should have not repeated the mistake, his judgment came quickly. So we must be prepared. Because it may not come today. It may not come tomorrow. It may not come in a few years. It may not even come in this lifetime. But judgment will come. It may not come until we're standing before God and we have to stand accountable for every sin and every mistake we've ever made. And He brings them out and we have to live and be accountable. But here's the deal. There's hope. There's hope for us. Because like we learned about today in worship, God is loving. God is forgiving. And His love leads to grace, and His grace leads to forgiveness. Nebuchadnezzar was able to see the truth, and he accepted it, and he moved forward. He was humbled by God, and then he exalted God. That is who God is. He is a God of second chances. He is a God that no matter what mistakes you have made, no matter what mistakes you have done, He is willing to forgive you. And here's the deal. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to live a perfect life. You don't have to live up to your standards or my standards or your parents' standards. You have to live up to God's standards. And He knows that we are going to fail. And He knows that we are not going to be perfect. And He's still willing to forgive us. Like that song we sang, God Calls My Name, and I ran out of that grave. When God calls our name, when He calls you, He already knows what He's getting. He already knows you're broken. He already knows you're going to fail Him. He already knows you're going to sin again. He already knows you're going to repeat the mistakes. But His forgiveness is final. There's nothing you can do to mess that up. When He calls your name and you run out of that grave, you are forgiven, and there's nothing that you can do to change that. So we have a choice. We need to recognize what God did for us. The fact that He sent His Son to die on the cross to give us that second chance. He responded to our sin by not only bringing judgment, but by bringing the answer to that judgment and sending His Son. And now the response comes to us. How will you respond to your sin? Will you learn from past mistakes? Or will you seek Him and seek His forgiveness? When you sin, do you run and pile on? Do you run and make it worse? Or do you turn before Him humbly like Nebuchadnezzar, bowing your head and allowing Him to forgive you? How will you respond to your sin? Will you run? Or will you accept His forgiveness? Because it's there for you. Let's bow our heads in prayer.